Every 9 minutes, there is a table saw injury in the US, which means there are over 60,000 per year, and 3,000 of those result in amputations. But this video will demonstrate how to safely use a saw, break down the differences between portable and stationary machines, talk about why I have a SawStop, plus I'll be giving this away to one of you. I don't have any data on this, but I'm of the belief there are two common causes of table saw injuries. The first and most dangerous is kickback. Long story short on the physics here, but the workpiece rides up the back of the blade and then is flung towards you, the operator, in fractions of a second. Now there are plenty of videos going into more detail, even showing amazing slow motion captures like this one from Jonathan Katz-Moses. And I'll leave a link below. But if you're just getting started, it would behoove you to watch a couple examples. Aside from a sharp piece of wood being thrown towards your body, the real danger happens when your hand goes with the workpiece and is potentially pulled right over the top of the blade before you even realize what happened. Sadly, nearly all kickback injuries could have been prevented with a riving knife or a splitter. While they aren't guaranteed to keep you safe, a riving knife makes it much less likely that the workpiece can travel up the back of the blade. But if you really want to keep yourself as safe as possible, there are blade guards, which we will discuss later on. The second scenario comes purely from impatience and attempting to grab an offcut or workpiece before the blade stops spinning. Again, no data here, but I'm going to bet the majority of people who get injured in this manner tend to be more experienced with a table saw. And why do I say that? Because most beginners are really intimidated by these machines. They are loud and quite terrifying. But as we become more comfortable with the table saw and we get into batch cutting, that's when complacency sets in and a brief lapse in focus can alter the rest of your life. The following setup principles apply to everyone, no matter what kind of saw you own. The fence needs to be parallel to the miter slots or toed out away from the blade towards the end of the fence by a couple thousandths of an inch. This is exaggerated for the sake of demonstration, but imagine if the end of your fence is towed in towards the blade. As your workpiece travels through the cut, the fence is pushing it up the back of the blade, which leads to a kickback. The key here is to ensure that your blade is also parallel to the miter slots, and every saw has different ways to adjust, and there are plenty of videos out there on the topic. Again, regardless of the type of saw, it's good practice to keep the bed of your saw waxed so wood easily slides across the top. A simple can of paste wax will do the trick. Now, don't wear loose-fitting clothes or anything like this hood that has draw cords, and always wear hearing and eye protection. All right, our table saw is set up and ready to go, but before firing it on, you need to select a blade. If you purchase a new table saw, they will come equipped with a blade, and they are generally junk. Even if you splurge on something expensive like the SawStop, it's still bad. Additionally, using the wrong blade can be a safety hazard. I use two blades in my table saw. Now, the first stays on for 75% of my work, and that's a 40-tooth general purpose blade from Amana. If I'm going to be doing a lot of ripping and working with dense species, I switch to a dedicated 24-tooth rip blade from Ridge Carbide. Now, they also sell dedicated crosscut blades that have more teeth, but quite honestly, I've never seen the need on my table saw. The two most common cuts on a table saw are a rip and a crosscut. A rip cut is when you cut with the direction of the grain, and you place the long edge of the board up against the fence. I like to set my blade so the bottom of the gullets are just barely above the wood at its highest point. And my general rule of thumb is any width that's less than 10 inches, and I use something to push the material through the cut. There are plenty of videos highlighting the best push blocks or even how to select a push stick so it won't explode, but here's my take on it. Anything that looks like this isn't worth your time to begin with, so who cares if it explodes, just don't use them. I employ a gripper for just about every instance, and no, this isn't sponsored. I've had this for 7 years, and you can take note of the battle wounds. I also really like this push pad from Microjig because of the retractable feet on the back, and it seems to work really well for bigger, heavier stock. Now, on the rare occasion that the gripper or the push pad won't work, I employ something like this, or I just use a scrap piece of wood. One of the biggest mistakes I see people make during a cut is where to place your pushing device of choice. When you're still getting comfortable with the table saw, your natural tendency is to try and keep everything as far away from the blade as possible. But to give yourself the best control of the workpiece, try and center your pushing device on your piece of wood, or even position it closer to the blade. Don't keep it up along the fence. You're more likely to steer the workpiece into the back of the blade. I'm not sure where this originated, but a lot of new woodworkers like to guide or push the workpiece from the offcut side, and this is a major no-no. Pressure should be applied in 3 directions: down, towards the fence, and forward. And those 3 directions need to be happening in between the blade and the fence to operate a saw safely. Another common occurrence that can be very dangerous during rip cuts, especially when using big box store lumber, is pinching of the blade. And this generally happens when wood hasn't been properly dried. As you make a cut, the internal stress is released and the two sides of your cut will squeeze back together, completely bogging the blade down. Instead of pushing as hard as you can, which can be very dangerous, power the saw off, drive a wedge between the kerf, and then continue cutting. If you're finding this is happening with regularity and you have a lot of cuts to make, try making each rip cut in 2 passes. Remove half of the material in the first pass and then raise the blade to cut all the way through on the second. It's faster than the wedge technique, or just buy better wood. I've also seen and stupidly attempted myself to rip boards that are not flat, and that is another big no-no. This can lead to binding during the cut and increase the likelihood of a kickback. Now, if your workpiece can't sit safely on the saw bed without rocking back and forth, find another way to cut it. Best case scenario, flatten it with a jointer or jointing sled in the planer first. You always want to be mindful of where to position your body during a cut. I like to stand to the left of the blade during a rip cut, because if a kickback is going to happen, the line of fire will be right here, and it's best to keep your fragile self safely to the side. Now, there are instances when I will stand to the right of the blade, like when I'm making a beveled cut, because I know from experience it's likely the offcut will go flying backwards at groin level. Just like that. For everyone who feels it's necessary to complain about sponsor segments in a video, well, the table saw that you can win, that's thanks to the awesome support from today's sponsor, Policy Genius. Now, this was one of the easiest segments for me to say yes to because my wife and I have been using Policy Genius before my channel even existed. It turns out when you bring little humans into the world, it's a good idea to protect the family's future. God forbid anything should ever happen to one of us. Now, life insurance isn't fun to talk about, but things like a mortgage, childcare, and other expenses don't disappear when you're gone. What our family likes about Policy Genius and why we selected them is the process. The company was built to modernize the life insurance industry, and their technology makes it easy to compare quotes from top companies like AIG and Prudential in just a few clicks. With Policy Genius, you can find life insurance policies that start at just $17 per month for $500,000 of coverage. Their licensed agents can even help you find options that offer coverage in as little as a week without unnecessary medical exams. Additionally, the agents aren't incentivized to recommend one insurer over another. There are no added fees and all of your information is kept private. I can truly tell you it's a pleasant experience, and if you don't believe me, check out the thousands of 5-star reviews on Google and Trustpilot. Your loved ones deserve a financial safety net, and you deserve a smarter way to find and buy it. Head to policygenius.com/LincolnStreet or click the link in the description to get your free insurance quotes and see how much you can save. And remember, you're supporting the channel by clicking these links so that I can make more videos and then hopefully give you cool things like a table saw. Crosscuts get their name from cutting across the direction of the grain, and typically this is where people do a lot of dumb stuff. A general rule of thumb when cross-cutting is to avoid using the fence for anything that is wider than it is long, but I prefer a bit of common sense. If I can easily push a piece along the fence without it wanting to tip, I feel safe, but make your own judgment. When you can't use the fence, you need something like a miter gauge to move the workpiece through the cut. Don't freehand, ever. Now, all saws will come with a stock miter gauge, and like the stock blades, they're junk. But the good news is you can build your own crosscut sled, and there are plenty of videos online for that. If you're into buying instead of building, and there's nothing wrong with that, you can also purchase aftermarket sleds and miter gauges, and the nice thing here is that you can easily make angled cuts. The most important rule when using a miter gauge is to never, ever, for any reason, unless you're doing a non-through cut like a rabbit, use the fence at the same time. You run the risk of the offcut pinching between the blade and the fence and kicking back. Oh, you're waiting for the kickback clip. There it is. If you need to make a bunch of repeated crosscuts, you can use the fence with a stop block exactly as I'm showing here. This scrap piece of wood is 3/4 of an inch, so I add that to my desired measurement and you get to cutting. You can see the stop block creates a repeatable cut, but the piece won't bind on the fence. While this method works well, if I'm going to be making lots of small cuts, I prefer a crosscut sled because it supports the wood on the workpiece and the offcut side. Plus, you can utilize hold downs to keep your little mitts safe. Speaking of keeping your little fingers safe, let's talk about blade guards. There is no disputing table saw injuries would be dramatically reduced if more woodworkers regularly used a blade guard. But I myself am guilty of primarily using a riving knife. It's a bit like flossing. I should, but I don't out of sheer laziness. Then I have to lie to the dentist when my gums are bleeding, but I digress. The point being, good safe habits like flossing or using a blade guard are not fun. But if you make it a point of emphasis when first starting out, it's more likely to become standard practice. As my friend Scott Walsh says, do as I say, not as I do. YouTube is filled with videos telling you to buy this, not that, or must-have tools, and an item that often comes up around table saw safety are feather boards. They're great in theory since they act like a third hand, applying pressure towards the fence, giving you a more accurate cut that is also much less likely to kick back. But are they good in practice? Here's what I can tell you. These shine if you're making a bunch of cuts from stock that is the exact same width. But I found in my shop that's rarely the case, and I'm generally ripping boards that are different sizes. So while I do own this, I couldn't even tell you the last time it was used. Instead, I prefer the GSM stock guides, and let me just say, these are expensive and not a must-have, but they are fantastic if you can swing it. These do everything a featherboard can, plus apply downward pressure, and the width of the stock doesn't matter from one piece to the next. Again, I've got no data here, but I'm not even sure it's possible to try and create a kickback with these installed on your saw. It's truly one of the best purchases I've made for my shop from a safety and results perspective. What about smaller saws versus big saws? Because not everyone has the space to dedicate to a cabinet style saw. Some portable job site saws come with a stand, which is great because the saw can easily be used at a safe height. But sometimes you only get the saw. Now avoid the temptation to place your new toy on top of a workbench. Unless you're in the NBA, that's too high for the average human. You don't want to be reaching while making a cut. Whether you borrow something to be used as a stand or build it yourself, make sure the base is nice and stable. And remember, there will be a considerable amount of force beyond the base, which can lead to tipping. Because of their compact footprint, job site saws have smaller tops, and cuts that can easily be supported on a cabinet saw may become more precarious on the portable versions. You never want to be exerting a lot of force to keep the workpiece from falling off the back of the saw. So set up outfeed rollers for your longer and heavier cuts. And finally, smaller saws generally max out at 1 3/4 horsepower, which means they don't have the juice to support a full kerf blade like the 3 and 5 horsepower cabinet saws. So be sure to stick with anything labeled thin kerf when buying a blade. Before I talk about the hot button issue of SawStop, you might be wondering how to win this 10-inch DeWalt job site saw that even comes with a mobile base. It is very simple. You must be located in the lower 48 of the US. To enter the drawing, follow the link in the description and enter the keyword phrase funny. I will email the winner in 45 days and that's it. And I said email because I won't message you on YouTube. Those are all scams. Good luck. This was my first saw and I hope you are only entering to win if you truly need a table saw and this would make a difference in your shop. But what about SawStop? As a casual viewer of YouTube, you might think that if you start a channel, the company sends you a new saw as a rite of passage. But I'm here to tell you that simply isn't true. I know of 2 folks that have received a saw at no cost, just 2. The rest of the content creators, including myself, paid full price. In fact, I purchased mine before I even started Lincoln Street Woodworks. So why do I own one? When I owned the DeWalt job site saw, I got in the habit of always lowering the blade when I was done in the shop and unplugging the saw because I have curious young children. One afternoon, we were standing in the shop chatting with our good friends when my then 2-year-old son happened to sneak past us and turn on my saw. Trust me, when you're not expecting that to fire on in a small room that echoes, it'll give you a really good scare. But an even better scare is seeing your child near it. Now, while I had forgot to unplug the saw, I did remember to lower the blade, but it was at that moment I decided it was time to upgrade to a SawStop, because that event absolutely terrified me as a parent. Now, my story could have had a much worse ending, but fortunately I did just enough to prevent that from happening. So for me, the SawStop is an insurance policy, not just for my own fingers, but for everyone else that comes into my shop. And you're free to call me a bad parent in the comments section. I'm not sure I agree with it, but it's your right, just like it's my right to insure myself against fluke accidents. So is the SawStop required for safe table saw work? Of course not, and anyone who says otherwise and that it's the only saw you should consider buying isn't being reasonable. But even worse than that group of people are the naysayers that claim a SawStop makes you less safe, or I've been woodworking for 45 years and never had an accident. That's a waste of money. Accidents are just that, accidents. And anyone who would willingly turn down a safer machine if they have the means, just for the sake of pride, is someone you can't have a rational conversation with. No matter the brand, table saws are incredible machines and will open endless possibilities if you put safe habits into practice. But shop safety doesn't end here. Check out this video for how to set up a small shop with proper dust collection. We'll see ya.